Hi, welcome to the Pre-Snore History Hub. This video is all about the Paris Peace Agreement of 1973. So, an agreement was actually reached in October 1972. It was signed by the USA, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Provincial Revolutionary Government, or the Viet Cong. Nixon was happy with the timing because it came just before the presidential elections. If the war ended now, it would be a great achievement for Nixon during his presidency. In terms of the October Agreement, all countries would accept Vietnam as a single country. Reunification was to be negotiated and a new government to be elected. North Vietnam dropped its demand that President Thieu be replaced by a coalition. Nixon and Kissinger agreed to allow the North Vietnamese army to remain in the areas they controlled at the time of ceasefire. The Viet Cong were allowed to participate in the final settlement. A ceasefire agreement was reached and the USA agreed to withdraw all remaining troops within 60 days. All US prisoners of war would be repatriated, which means sent home, within 60 days. The armies of both South Vietnam's governments to remain, but no more US aid to the ARVN. And the US government could not intervene in Vietnamese politics, military or otherwise. So President Thieu actually rejected the agreements because he knew that the USA was about to abandon him. Talks were halted in December, and some of Kissinger's staff even suggesting having Thieu assassinated. That Congress would not grant him funds for the war in 1973, and therefore, after the bombing campaign began on the 18th of December 1972, to force North Vietnam to finally agree to peace terms. There's another video called The Bombing of the North if you want to find out a bit more about those December 72 bombings. On the 23rd of January 1973, a ceasefire was signed in Paris that essentially mirrored the agreement of October 1972. This time, President Thieu had no choice but to sign it. The USA was leaving Vietnam. This agreement was presented as the best possible solution available. President Nixon and Kissinger also assured Thieu that the USA would continue to aid the South Vietnamese and that if the agreement was violated by North Vietnam, help would be forthcoming. Thieu's continued objection was that North Vietnamese troops were permitted to remain in areas they controlled in the south. He felt that the sudden withdrawal of US forces would cripple the South's military strength, leaving them vulnerable if the North decided to violate the ceasefire. Nevertheless, on the 27th of January 1973, a formal agreement was signed and the war was officially over. So that is the headline from the New York Times announcing the ceasefire begins. So what was the significance of the Paris Peace Agreement? Kissinger and Le Duc Tho were awarded the 1973 Nobel Peace Prize. Kissinger accepted it while Le Duc Tho declined it, saying his country was not yet completely at peace. The agreement officially ended American involvement in Vietnam. However, the peace agreement did not end the Vietnam War. Shortly after the USA left South Vietnam in March 1973, the ceasefire collapsed. The Paris Peace Accords gave the USA a way to leave the war. However, the North and South Vietnamese both saw the peace as a brief ceasefire whilst the Americans withdrew. So, what were the impacts then on each different side? So, the impacts for the USA. By the 23rd of March 1973, there are officially only 150 US Marines in South Vietnam guarding the US Embassy. However, about 10,000 US military personnel had become civilian advisors and were still in Vietnam. Congress cut military funding and aid sent to South Vietnam was way below what Nixon had promised. This left the ARVN badly supplied. For the South Vietnamese, the economy of South Vietnam collapsed, partly due to the large reduction in US aid and the loss of income when the Americans left. It did not make the government more democratic or replace corrupt officials, so the VC was soon strong in the villages again. He didn't want to work with anyone. Meanwhile, North Vietnam's policy was to achieve a united communist Vietnam. So the North Vietnamese had become impatient with Thieu's refusal to negotiate. They sent troops and supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail and launched a new attack in December 74. ARVN could not cope. President Thieu asked US President Ford, so Ford came after Nixon, he was the next president after Nixon, and the US Congress for $300 million and for military equipment, and was infuriated when his request was denied by Congress. Thieu said that the North had received massive amounts of aid from China and the Soviet Union, and he didn't want to get left behind. Despite US assurances of help if South Vietnam was invaded, Congress did nothing but allowed funding to evacuate US citizens. The North Vietnamese won a key victory on the 11th of March 1975 and dislodged South Vietnamese troops from the provincial capital, the anchor of Saigon defences in the Central Highlands. As the communists drove towards Saigon virtually unopposed, Thieu pledged that his troops would defend it to the last bullet and the last grain of rice. Surrender came a month later. The fall of Saigon happened on the 30th of April 1975 and came much sooner than expected. So, what happens when Vietnam is reunited? When the end did come, Thieu's resignation was demanded by all sides, including his former allies in the USA, in order to make way for peace talks with the North Vietnamese. He reluctantly did step down on the 21st of April 1975 and he left the country, but the talks never came. South Vietnam was overrun shortly after his departure and Saigon was captured by the North Vietnamese on the 30th of April 1975. The government of North Vietnam united both North and the South on the 2nd of July 1976 to form the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. What was the impact in South Vietnam of the loss of US money? When the US troops left, about 300,000 South Vietnamese lost their jobs. South Vietnam was about $300 million worse off after their departure. At the same time, the aid that the South Vietnamese government was getting from the USA fell from $2.3 billion to $1 billion a year. The food shortages caused protests to rise, while unemployment levels meant that many people could not afford to pay for even basic needs. So that image shows a North Vietnamese tank crashing through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon in April 1975. The taking of the palace marked the fall of the US-backed South during the Vietnam War. Hey, don't forget to subscribe to the Personal History Hub. In the next video, we're going to be looking at the cost of the war for the USA.